Our story begins not with a pen, but with a wound. For over a year, the unthinkable had been happening. Blood had been shed between British subjects and British soldiers. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. The names were already etched in anguish. A siege of Boston. An invasion of Canada that ended in snow and despair. By the spring of 1776, the question hanging in the air, thick as the humidity in a Philadelphia parlor, was no longer one of protest or reconciliation. It was a question of sovereignty. Were the American colonists fighting for their rights as Englishmen within the British Empire, or were they declaring themselves to be something new, something that had never existed before? A people. Imagine Philadelphia in June of 1776. It is the second largest city in the English-speaking empire, a bustling port of 40,000 souls. But it is a city under pressure, a city holding its breath. The Pennsylvania State House, which we now call Independence Hall, is the epicenter. Inside, the Second Continental Congress is in session. These are not the unified, saint-like figures of myth. They are a collection of lawyers, merchants, and planters, proud, touchy, fiercely intelligent men, representing 13 distinct colonies with 13 distinct interests, suspicions, and fears. They are, in many ways, like 13 squabbling siblings trapped in a room with a ticking clock. And the clock was loud. From the north, the drums of a massive British invasion force were echoing in the imagination. The largest amphibious expedition in British history was even then assembling off the coast of New York. General Washington, whose army had just managed to drive the British from Boston, was frantically trying to fortify Manhattan, a task he himself described as nearly impossible. The stakes could not have been higher. To declare independence now was not just an act of political defiance, it was an act of potential suicide. If you were a delegate, you had to ask yourself, am I signing my own death warrant? If the British won, and they almost certainly would, this piece of paper would be used as evidence of treason. And the penalty for treason was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This is the mystery's first layer, the immense, almost unbearable pressure. And yet, the idea of independence was gaining a furious, groundswell momentum. In January, a radical English immigrant named Thomas Paine had published a pamphlet called Common Sense. It wasn't a legal argument or a philosophical treatise, it was a thunderbolt written in plain language. He called King George III a royal brute and argued that it was simply common sense for a large continent to be ruled by an island thousands of miles away. It swept through the colonies, selling over 100,000 copies. It changed the conversation from, "What are our rights?" to, "Why don't we just rule ourselves?" By June, the legislatures of individual colonies, from New Hampshire to Georgia, were instructing their delegations to vote for independence. The moderate voices, those still clinging to the hope of reconciliation, were being drowned out. The center could not hold. And so, on June 7, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, acting on instructions from his colony, rose and introduced a momentous resolution. It was simple and blunt, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The room fell silent. Then, the arguments began. The moderates, led by the powerful John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, pleaded for delay. "We are not ready," they argued. "We have not secured foreign alliances. We are not united. To rush now is to guarantee our destruction." Congress, ever pragmatic, did two things. First, they postponed the vote on Lee's resolution for 3 weeks, until July 1, to allow for consensus building. Second, they appointed a committee of 5 men and gave them a task: draft a public declaration, a statement to the world, explaining this potentially cataclysmic decision. They were writing the justification for an act that had not yet even been agreed upon. Who were these 5 men? It's a fascinating cast. There was Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, the wily, famous, and beloved elder statesman, a man of science and wit. There was John Adams of Massachusetts, the Atlas of Independence, a brilliant, passionate, and sometimes overbearing lawyer who had been the leading voice for a break with Britain for months. There was Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a quiet, practical, and deeply respected judge. There was Robert R. Livingston of New York, a young, aristocratic lawyer from a colony deeply divided on the issue, a man whose vote was uncertain. And then, there was the fifth member. A young, tall, quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. At 33, Jefferson was one of the youngest delegates. He was not a great orator like Patrick Henry or Richard Henry Lee. When he spoke in Congress, it was softly, almost mumbling. But he had a reputation as a brilliant writer. A year earlier, he had written a powerful, though rejected, declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms. John Adams, who was expected to write the document, saw in Jefferson a perfect tool. Adams later recalled the conversation. Jefferson asked him, "Why will you not write it?" Adams replied with a list of reasons. Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. There's a charming human detail here. John Adams, the workhorse, willingly stepping aside for Thomas Jefferson, the wordsmith. They went to Jefferson's lodgings at a bricklayer's house on the corner of 7th and Market Streets. In a second-floor parlor, over the next 17 days, Jefferson sat at a portable, lap desk of his own design. He wrote. He drafted. He crossed out. He consulted with Adams and Franklin, who made small but significant edits. And in that small room, with the fate of a continent pressing on his shoulders, he produced a masterpiece of political philosophy and soaring prose. The genius of Jefferson's draft was that it wasn't entirely new. He synthesized the ideas of the Enlightenment, the philosophy of John Locke, into a set of principles that felt both universal and deeply personal. He didn't just list grievances, he framed them within a radical new purpose of government. He wrote of truths held to be self-evident, a powerful, unarguable phrase. He declared that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the spark. It transformed a colonial rebellion into a universal human struggle. And then, in the second half, he laid out a devastating, point-by-point indictment of King George III, a list of repeated injuries and usurpations, painting the king not as a misguided father, but as a tyrant unfit to rule a free people. But the document, as beautiful as it was just a draft. The real drama was still to come. On July 1, the 3-week postponement was over. Congress resolved itself into a committee of the whole to debate Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. The windows were thrown open, but it did little good. The air was thick with the heat of the Philadelphia summer and the heat of argument. John Dickinson, the man who would later be called the penman of the Revolution, made one last, magnificent, and desperate plea. He was not a loyalist. He had argued passionately for colonial rights. But he believed that a formal declaration of independence at this moment was madness. He predicted, with chilling accuracy, the devastation that would follow. He spoke of fire, sword, and the gibbet. He argued that they were rushing headlong into an abyss. It was, by all accounts, one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered in that chamber. When he finished, a profound silence fell. Then, John Adams rose. He was Dickinson's philosophical opposite. Where Dickinson saw catastrophe, Adams saw the birth pangs of liberty. He thundered in reply. He defended the resolution, arguing that the time for debate was over, the time for action had come. He spoke for hours, his voice ringing with conviction. The debate raged all day. When the vote finally came, the result was not the unanimous picture we often imagine. 9 colonies voted yes. But Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted no. The Delaware delegation was split. And the powerful, crucial delegation from New York, still under instructions from its legislature to oppose independence, could not vote at all. It was a failure. To issue a declaration in the name of 13 united colonies with such deep division would be a catastrophic blow. The moderates had managed to delay the final, official vote until the next day, July 2. Overnight, the corridors of the State House and the boarding houses of Philadelphia buzzed with frantic, last-minute negotiations. The story goes that two moderate delegates from Pennsylvania, sensing the tide of history, deliberately stayed away the next day, allowing their colony's vote to flip to a yes. In South Carolina, the delegation was persuaded to change its vote for the sake of unity. In Delaware, a young, passionate delegate named Caesar Rodney received an urgent message. He was at home, 80 miles away, suffering from the cancer that would eventually kill him. He mounted his horse and rode through a violent thunderstorm all night, arriving at the State House on the morning of July 2, muddy, exhausted, and just in time to cast the decisive vote for independence. On July 2, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted to approve Richard Henry Lee's resolution. 12 colonies voted yes. New York, still waiting for permission, abstained. But the decision was made. John Adams, in his excitement, wrote a letter to his wife Abigail the very next day. He predicted that future generations would celebrate the 2nd of July as the great anniversary festival, with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. He was wrong about the date, but he captured the electric thrill of the moment. The act of severing ties had been taken. The United States of America were, in principle, born. But the story is not over. The why had been decided, but the what, the public explanation, still needed to be refined. For the next 2 days, July 3 and July 4, Congress turned its attention to Jefferson's draft declaration. And this is where our story takes a fascinating, and for Thomas Jefferson, a painful turn. These were not just polite editors. They were hardened politicians, and they tore into his elegant prose with surgical precision. They cut and slashed. They changed words and deleted entire passages. Jefferson sat in silent agony, watching men he considered his inferiors butcher his beautiful sentences. The most significant change, and the one that haunted Jefferson for the rest of his life, was the removal of a long, passionate passage condemning the institution of slavery. Jefferson, a slave owner himself, had written a searing indictment of King George for perpetuating the slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature itself. But the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies were utterly dependent on slavery, would never accept it. They were joined by delegates from the North, who were complicit in the shipping of slaves. The passage was struck out entirely. Jefferson was heartbroken. He later wrote that it was done to compliment the sensibilities of South Carolina and Georgia. The idealistic declaration, in its very first act of editing, was stained by the original sin that would one day tear the nation apart. Finally, on the morning of July 4, the delegates reconvened. The weather had broken. It was cooler, with a gentle rain falling outside. They made a few final, minor changes. And then, they approved the document. They voted to accept the Declaration of Independence. Now, here is one of the greatest mysteries of all, the signing. Contrary to the famous painting by John Trumbull, which shows the entire committee presenting the document to John Hancock on July 4 with everyone beaming and crowded together, that scene never happened. It is a magnificent fiction. On July 4, after the vote, it is believed that only 2 men actually signed the document, John Hancock, the President of the Congress, and Charles Thomson, the Secretary. Hancock, with his famously bold, defiant signature, did so to attest that the document had been approved. The famous story of him saying, "There. John Bull can read my name without spectacles, and may now double his reward of 1,000 for my head," is likely from a later, more embellished account. But it captures the spirit perfectly. The document, the official, handwritten parchment copy we know today, was then sent to a printer named John Dunlap. Throughout the night of July 4th and into the morning of the 5th, Dunlap worked his press, printing perhaps 200 broadsides. These Dunlap broadsides were the first published versions of the Declaration of Independence, and they were the ones read to the crowds, distributed to the armies, and sent to the king. The actual, formal signing of the parchment copy was a slow, drawn-out affair. Most delegates signed it on August 2, 1776. Some signed weeks or even months later. One delegate, Thomas McKean of Delaware, may not have signed it until 1781. They didn't all sign on one glorious day, because they were all committing treason, and for many, it was a decision that required a moment of profound, personal courage, often taken after they had returned to their home states and consulted with their own legislatures. So, we arrive at the heart of the mystery. The Declaration of Independence was not a single event, but a process. It was a decision made on July 2, a document approved on July 4, and a pact sealed in blood over many months. Think of the men who signed it. They were not all saints. They were not all visionaries. Some were reluctant, some were terrified, some were ambitious, some were principled. But on that day, and in the days that followed, they looked at the mightiest empire on earth, an empire with the largest navy and the most professional army in the world, an empire that had just sent 400 ships and 30,000 soldiers to crush them. And they said, no. They pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they meant it. Many of them lost their fortunes. Nearly all of them saw their lives threatened. A few of them, like Richard Stockton of New Jersey, were captured by the British, tortured, and died as a result of their treatment. They signed a document that was, in the truest sense, a suicide pact. They were traitors until they won. When we look at that faded parchment today, we are not looking at a piece of paper. We are looking at the fossilized imprint of an impossible, terrifying, and magnificent act of courage. It is the ghost of a gamble so audacious that it still has the power to astonish. So, the next time you see the image of the Declaration, do not just see the words. See the humid room, the buzzing flies, the sound of carriages on the cobblestones outside. See John Dickinson, heartbroken, walking away from the debate he lost. See Caesar Rodney, mud-splattered and weary, casting his vote. See Thomas Jefferson, wincing as Congress deletes his words. And see John Hancock, his pen scratching across the parchment, daring the king to do his worst. They knew, in that moment, that they were stepping into the unknown. They were creating a nation dedicated to a proposition. And the mystery, the beautiful, enduring mystery, is that it worked. They did not know the ending. And because they didn't, they gave us all a beginning. Friends, if you are interested in the true history of the United States without embellishment, subscribe to the Empire of Freedom channel. Click on the bell so you don't miss anything.